Thanks for being with me today, Slade. I wanted to ask you, because I think you wrote a really interesting piece recently on being a pro-life libertarian, and I wanted to bring you on, kind of talk about some of the issues that you raised there. But first, lay out for me kind of the argument, why you're a pro-life libertarian, why you think, because generally in the libertarian movement, it's kind of assumed that libertarians all have this box of quote-unquote liberal social views, and that contains being pro-choice, being pro-gay marriage, generally pro-drug legalization, and that's this, liberal social box that all libertarians usually are expected to subscribe to. You don't. Why don't you tell me why and kind of lay out that argument that you made?
Sure. So libertarians generally, as sort of a generalization, are fiscally conservative and socially liberal. But I think it's important to note that it's not just among libertarians that abortion is sort of an exception to the rule. Among young people who tend to be extremely socially liberal, they're actually just as likely to be pro-life as older voters. And in fact, in some recent Pew research that I looked at, 18 to 29-year-olds were more pro-life than 30 to 64-year-olds, even though they're much, much, much more socially liberal across the battery of other issues, drug legalization, same-sex marriage, all of that. So I think it's important to recognize that for a lot of people, abortion is sort of a different monster. And that's how I feel about it. And I think that's how a lot of libertarians feel about it too, which is that libertarianism can tell you how to feel about abortion once you've answered the question of, is abortion an act that involves one human being or two human beings? But libertarianism can't really answer that first fundamental question. Because, libertarian philosophy says, people should have maximal freedom to live their lives. But until you know, what is a people? You can't really then go into whether an abortion is an infringement on someone's freedom or someone's rights. So I think that I view abortion as sort of outside the scope, or at least I view the question of whether abortion involves two human beings as outside the scope of what libertarianism can answer. So you have to kind of look elsewhere. You have to look at science. You have to listen to your conscience. You have to talk to people you trust. You have to do these different things. Consult your faith if you're a person of faith. And I am, full disclosure, I'm sort of Reason Magazine's token resident Roman Catholic, and that definitely plays a role in how I came to hold this view. The fact of the matter is, when I look at an ultrasound, I see a human baby. Not everyone does. And so I understand why within the big tent of libertarianism, there are some people that come down on the pro-choice side and some people like me that come down on the pro-life side. Basically, I think if you've established that the thing in the womb is a person, then libertarian philosophy, since most libertarians adhere to this thing called the non-aggression principle that says you shouldn't aggress against other people, you would basically have to become pro-life from there. But until you start by answering that first question, you kind of don't know what libertarian philosophy can't tell you where to go until you have a starting point.
Yeah, so I identify, in full disclosure, I guess, as a pro-choice conservative and generally non-religious in any way. And one of the interesting things is I feel like, and I'm very guilty of this myself, on the abortion issue, like you said, young people don't have the same kind of social liberal evolution that we see with young people on other issues like gay marriage, like drug legalization, that we put into that social issues box. And I think you're right that it's a much more fundamental question of, like you said, does abortion involve one person or two people? And I think I'm guilty of kind of not really understanding and probably talking past people when I talk about abortion. And the one thing that kind of always got to me was I don't know if you would call it a rallying cry, the idea that life begins at conception, right? And to me, basically forever, what I interpreted that phrase to mean was at conception, the unborn baby, the fetus, at conception should have all of the legal rights as a newly born baby in the hospital, right? And it was recently explained to me that's not exactly the case. And I kind of wanted to get your perspective on that. When I hear life begins at conception, I hear people saying, basically, abortion should be outlawed from the moment of conception. And I wanted to ask you if that's kind of a universal feeling among the pro-life movement in general.
I think it's pretty common. I think if you talk to people who are strongly pro-life, a lot of them are going to say that life begins at conception, and therefore it's immoral because you're taking a human life anytime after conception. Among the general public, though, among the larger pool of people who just identify as pro-life or who hold sort of generally pro-life views, there's a lot more gray area. It's very interesting, and it goes both ways. Among people who identify as strongly pro-choice, I should add, most of them actually think that abortions should be outlawed after about the halfway point of pregnancy, even though they identify as strongly pro-choice. And among the strongly pro-life people who aren't activists, who aren't making this, making a living out of talking about this issue, a lot of them, they think it's a human life, but they're willing to sort of entertain different situations and different circumstances. And, if the child was conceived and raped, maybe they view that differently. If it's in the first 8 weeks, they might view that differently than if it's after 24 weeks. In fact, it's very, very common for people to make that distinction, despite the fact that they accept life begins at conception. Not everybody is willing to therefore take the next step and say, therefore, it should always and everywhere be illegal, no matter what, unless it's to save the life of the mother. Abortion shouldn't exist. Maybe that's the most intellectually consistent position, and it's actually pretty close to what I believe. But it's not necessarily what everyone who identifies as pro-life would ultimately say or where they would come down.
Right, and I would cop to being completely inconsistent on the issue as well. I feel like there's the extremes between at conception, an unborn child has the full rights and legal protections as a newly born child, and there's the view that until the child passes through the birth canal, it does not have any of those rights. And those, to me, are coherent and intellectually consistent positions. I'm someone who identifies as pro-choice, but still recognizes, I think, that a lot of late-term abortions are, I don't know what you would say, icky, kind of disturbing on a fundamental level. So I'm someone who, I suppose, doesn't find all that much moral objection to the Republicans or conservatives or libertarians, in your case, who would like to roll back some of the legal protections for late-term abortion. But I'm also someone who finds some of the push to outlaw abortion earlier than kind of what the status quo generally is to be troubling as well. And I would say I'm a completely inconsistent person who largely comes down on the side of the legal status quo for abortion in America is pretty good. And I feel like you talked about the polling. The polling largely reflects that, is that even on the fairly activist pro-choice side, there's not much pushback against laws that would roll back protections for late-term abortion. And even on the pro-life side, people aren't really pushing for laws that would outlaw first-term abortion. So to me, it's almost as if we're for all the heated rhetoric and for all the fighting, intra-movement fighting over it, we're kind of at a stalemate in this country on where abortion should be and kind of accepting of what the general legal status quo is right now.
Well, there are some movements in various states to draw a line at either 24 weeks or 20 weeks, which is earlier than it had been in most places until recently. And those policies are pretty popular, actually. I mean, they enjoy support from minorities in most places, including among pro-choicers in a lot of cases. And so that would be a change to the status quo, but it's an incremental change. It's not just a wholesale abortion is banned always, no matter what, tomorrow. It's sort of, I think, as technology progresses and advances, and as we're starting to see babies born at 21 weeks surviving, people start to become more uncomfortable with the idea of abortions at 28 weeks. And that makes sense. I mean, I understand where they're coming from there. And so I think I see the line sort of being moved back as the moment of viability. I mean, viability is not necessarily a thing that's fixed, as it dependent on where the technology allows a child that's born early to, at what point they can survive. And as babies born earlier and earlier can survive, that moves the point of viability back, and it also moves the Roe v. Wade protection back, and it moves people towards accepting, I think, more restrictions earlier on in a pregnancy.
Right. I think one of the, I suppose, uncomfortable truces around this is a lot of people have agreed on, like you said, the point of viability as being a solid line where you could draw, abortion is okay before that, not okay afterwards. But like you said, and I wonder about this. Medical technology is pushing the point of viability earlier and earlier. And even, I find the point of viability it's kind of an inconsistent truth to me because, obviously if you say like 22 weeks, that's the point of viability, abortion okay before, not okay afterwards. In the womb, they develop at different rates. You're going to have, abortions happen that are on viable babies, even at that legal line. And you're going to have, protections for non-viable fetuses after that. So that to me, it's an appealing line to draw, but it's not necessarily a consistent one to me.
Yeah, it's really hard to do. And same thing with fetal pain, the idea of when can the baby in the womb start to feel pain. Some people say it's at 20 weeks. Some people say it's at 24 weeks. There's some evidence that it's a lot earlier than that, or at least that the baby will respond to stimuli a lot earlier, as if, they're experiencing pain. And so that's a consideration a lot of people want to be able to take into account is, can my baby feel it? If I kill it and they're totally unaware and they don't feel anything, that feels different to us than if the baby is sort of aware, and at 28 weeks the baby can hear you talking. That's to me, it's incredible to think that we would be considering that baby not a human life at that point, but I guess not everyone agrees with me.
And when you just said not a human life, you mean, and this is what I try and clarify, you mean entitled to, legal protections?
Yeah, so, life begins at conception. That's just a scientific term. The issue becomes, is it a person at that point? Does it get rights at that point, or is it at some later point?
Right.
And that's where the disagreement is. Because it's very interesting. It used to be that a lot of pro-choicers would say, they would deny life doesn't begin at conception. You're crazy. That's not really the case anymore. Now everyone's pretty much in agreement. Science says the definition of life, the nucleus, that it has all its DNA at the moment of conception.
Yeah.
So the life is there. But the question is, is there some other thing that happens when it becomes a person deserving of the same protections that you or I have?
Right. So I wanted to ask you how, I guess, your piece was received in the libertarian movement because, like I introduced this, libertarianism is generally considered to be on the pro-choice side of things. And I've heard libertarians say, you can't be a real, quote-unquote, libertarian without being pro-choice. And I wanted to ask you, how much support you got, how much pushback you got. You do have people saying, you're not a real libertarian, you're a fake libertarian. Because it was kind of framed around Senator Rand Paul, which also, he's pro-life. His father, who was a huge figure in the libertarian movement, was pro-life as well, and saying, it's not inconsistent to be a libertarian and be pro-life.
Yeah. So basically, it was a few weeks ago, I was reading through the news and I came across this Salon article in which this, feminist blogger wrote, well, Rand Paul claims to be a libertarian, but obviously he's not. I think the quote was that he plays fast and loose with his libertarian principles when it comes to reproductive health. And I thought to myself, the implication is you can't be a true libertarian and also be pro-life.
I know I always go to salons to ask them, who's a real libertarian.
Right, which is exactly, and I found it very insulting because here I am, I work for a libertarian magazine, I speak at libertarian conferences, and I'm extremely pro-life. And so I was a little bit insulted. It's always a little bit insulting when I hear somebody on the, far side of the political universe trying to tell me that what I believe isn't truly libertarian, as if they know better than I do. As if they've spent half as much time as I have studying these ideas. The truth is that libertarians, the feedback I got on this article I wrote was extremely positive. I got there were some people who posted comments who disagreed, but I think most libertarians, largely, they understand that you can't answer this question solely with libertarian philosophy. And so that it's possible to be a consistent libertarian, a true libertarian, and be pro-life or to be pro-choice. I got lots and lots of letters, more mail than I've gotten for anything else I've ever written for Reason, saying, thank you so much for finally writing writing this piece, because I completely agree with you, and I feel sometimes like I'm the only one, and please know that you're not alone. It was really positive. And another thing I would add is it's very interesting that although there were some commenters who said you can't, they said it's impossible to be a pro-life libertarian because if we believe in the right sort of self-determination and the right of a woman to make choices for herself, then you can't legislate against that. There were also people commenting on Facebook and in the comment section of this post on the opposite side saying I think it's impossible to be a pro-choice libertarian because we believe in the non-aggression principle and we think that murder is wrong, using force against another human being is wrong. And so if you want to have the right, your right to do what you want with your body is trumped by my right not to be murdered. And so there were equally people on both sides saying, you can't believe the other side of this issue and still be a libertarian. But for the most part, I think most libertarians, they know people on both sides of this issue, and they can see where people on both sides of this issue are coming from. And so I was pleasantly surprised by the feedback I got.
Yeah, I think that speaks to, like you said, you can't really determine what the right answer on abortion is from libertarian first principles. Because like you said, I actually think I've never heard it put succinctly like you did earlier, that it depends on if it involves one person or two people. And that, to me, is the whole kind of crux of the argument, and everything else around it is just noise. And I'm not surprised. I think there are a lot of libertarians who are pro-life. I know a lot of them. But it is still kind of generally in the media assumed that if you're a libertarian, you subscribe to the pro-choice side of the equation. But I wanted to kind of transition from that into, I know, and, on the very, 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 very broad spectrum of what is considered the right in America, and even saying that, I'm probably getting into some hot water here, but I consider, libertarianism to be on the, quote-unquote, on the right with conservatism. But libertarianism is a very large heterodox movement. And despite that, I feel like it's a more heterodox and diverse movement than almost any other major political movement right now, especially one of its size. But I find that despite that, there are so many kind of preconceived biases that go into it if you slap yourself with the label libertarian. If I go to a stranger who's relatively politically informed, and if I were to say I'm a libertarian, which I don't, I say I'm a conservative, but that kind of imprints all these views upon them about who I am and what I think. But I've known pro-war libertarians, pro-drug prohibition libertarians, pro-very secure border libertarians. And I wanted to know your perspective. Obviously, you're in the libertarian movement. You work for a explicitly libertarian magazine. What your experience is on the vehement movement policing that occurs in the libertarian movement when someone comes across views that are considered to be not a true libertarian view.
It definitely happens, and it varies from person to person within the movement. Some people you talk to are really big on the big tent sort of thing. We're a big tent philosophy. A lot of different people can sort of come into our tent and be identified as a libertarian. And in fact, if we want to make progress on the political scale, we need to be welcoming people in who maybe only hold some libertarian views but are open to learning about others. Then there are others that are more purist. If you're not an anarchist, you're not really a libertarian in their minds. But I think the really interesting thing to remember is how much the movement has been growing in the recent years, in the last decade. I mean, it's remarkable how much has changed, and there's a lot of credit to be given to Ron Paul and his 2 presidential campaigns for that. Nowadays, when young people come to Reason magazine hoping for an internship, interviewing for an internship with us, we ask them, how did you first become exposed to libertarian ideas? They say it was Dr. Paul's campaign that first got me interested in learning about libertarianism, and then I took it from there. And so as young people have become more and more interested in these ideas, and, when I was in college, Students for Liberty, the big college libertarian organization, didn't exist yet. And last year I got a chance to go to the International Students for Liberty conference. It was like 1,500 students from around the world were here in D.C. Like, that's a remarkable change. As any movement grows like that, you're going to see not everyone agreeing 100% of the time. It's easy to sort of enforce conformity when the movement is a tiny, tiny fringe, like it was, 60 years ago, 50 years ago. But today, it's an enormous global movement. And so, of course, not everyone's going to agree on everything. And I tend to be of the opinion that that's okay, that we should continue to try to advance ideas and move people in the direction of libertarian policies, but that it's not, we shouldn't be kicking people out for disagreeing with us on, 1 out of 10 issues.
Yeah, I've especially seen, I think, there's the quote-unquote left libertarian movement, and I've seen a lot of libertarians say those aren't real libertarians if you identify on the left, and I would probably say that's incorrect. So you attributed the giant growth of the libertarian movement to Ron Paul and probably to a lesser extent now his son Rand Paul. I would attribute it a lot to President Obama. I remember when George W. Bush was in office, there's a really great web forum called Cato at Liberty that they run kind of dialogues every month. And when George W. Bush was in office, they had one on quote-unquote libertarians. And the founder of the Daily Kos, Marcos Moulitsas, wrote an article about how libertarians should properly be understood as creatures of the liberal movement, the left in America. And obviously this is in the George W. Bush era. And I think he would explicitly disavow that now because Daily Kos and Salon and Alternet and places like that drum up lots of clicks, page views by just beating up on libertarians because they consider them to be these weird moral monsters on the political spectrum. Now that President Obama is, and I attribute that entirely because President Obama is in office and largely has implemented unfriendly to libertarian-ish policies. But I would also say that, that's just largely a product of being in power, and a lot of the self-identified conservative-ish, libertarian-ish people in the movement right now who merely just oppose President Obama's policies and like what libertarians have to say about President Obama's policies might become more traditional conservatives and kind of Republican Party team players if in 4 years we're looking at a President Rubio second run for the White House or something like that.
The nature of being a libertarian is that you're almost always against whoever's in power. But to maybe push back a little bit on what you were saying there, one of the reasons Ron Paul did well in 2008, I think, was that young people, including members of the military, who supported Ron Paul's campaign, I think his primary campaign more than any other candidate, were those who were actually in the military. They saw what happened after we went into Iraq, and they didn't like what they saw. And they started to, there's a pretty strong still anti-interventionist strain among young libertarians where they say, like, we saw what getting involved in Iraq looked like, and we don't support that. And we want to be against any movement that is going to make it more likely that we're going to be getting involved in more, entangling ourselves in more international problems. So I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's quite right to say that the sort of blowback is solely against Obama. I think there was a lot of it that was against Bush's policies, his foreign policies, that got some young people thinking about an alternative to the sort of basic two-party system. And is there a better way? Is there a third way? Back as far as 2006 and 2008. Now, of course, with Obama in office and doing a lot of things that we tend not to agree with, there's going to be, you're totally right, that there's going to be people who might otherwise be considered sort of, middle-of-the-road conservatives who are now looking for somebody who's willing to be even more forceful in their opposition to what's going on. And so they're now looking at the libertarian movement as maybe something they'd be interested in learning more about.
Yeah, I would say, I know there was a lot of movement among libertarians to actually support President Obama against John McCain in 2008 because John McCain appeared to be a fairly traditional continuation of President Bush's policies. And I think it's mildly famous on the internet. That Reason, which I love, you guys do great work, and this is a particular part that I love, publishes how the writers vote in every presidential election. And I remember in 2008, there was a fair number, maybe a majority, who voted for President Obama. And once 2012 came around and President Obama actually got to wield the power that he was given for 4 years, I think there were 0 votes for President Obama's reelection among the Reason staff. And obviously the staff changes in 4 years and it's not the same, but I think it's a fairly good representation of where libertarians were pre-2008 and then what they saw after Obama got into office.
Yes.
And I would say it's not entirely attributable to the major hated policies that both conservatives and libertarians get behind, which are, the stimulus, the bailouts, Dodd-Frank, and Obamacare, but largely attributable to, and I think this is something that both libertarians and progressives didn't see coming, President Obama's record on civil liberties and record of intervention abroad, specifically in Libya.
Yes.
That kind of turned libertarians as saying, "Oh, actually, we can't just trust the people who say nice things before they get into power." And not that people really believed President Obama's rhetoric pre-election, but I think it was a fairly significant wake-up call what he did once he got into office.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I wasn't working for Reason during either of the previous 2 presidential elections, but a lot of my colleagues, they voted for Obama in 2008. In some cases, in a lot of cases, it's the only election they've ever voted in because they were so hopeful that this guy might be different, that he might be truly committed to criminal justice reform, that he might really be willing to get the troops out of places overseas and do things like close down the prison at Guantanamo. They were really hopeful. These are the things he campaigned on, and it seemed like he was speaking directly to them and to the issues that they cared about as libertarians, and they supported him. And they've been so disappointed by his actual presidency. Now there's a couple years left, and he is starting to make moves that make it look like he might be doing some things that we would be likely to cheer, commutations of sentences for nonviolent drug offenses and things like that. And so I think we're hopeful that, he might do something to redeem himself a little bit during his last year in office. But the bulk of his presidency has not lived up even close to what I think a lot of libertarians were hoping for back in 2007, 2008.
Yeah. I think something that is interesting kind of playing off of this is movement policing more generally. It happens a lot in the libertarian movement, maybe more than others, but it's been happening in the conservative movement for a very long time. I'm not sure where the origin of the term rhino comes from, but that's kind of a very prominent phrase to say, you're not conservative enough to be in the conservative movement, even though it explicitly refers to the Republican Party. And basically, I'm not sure when, but I would maybe attribute it to the 1994 Gingrich Revolution, the rise of talk radio in general, as a force to kind of, quote unquote, keep politicians honest. And, now there are voting scorecards, there are activist movements, there are, write your congressman campaigns that all have been empowered by technology so much more than we have in the past, that I think movement policing and of elected officials more generally is a lot more prominent nowadays than it used to be. And this I kind of see in the polarization of voting in Congress. It used to be that you would have liberal members of the Republican Party and conservative members of the Democratic Party actually be on opposite sides of many issues. But now it's a lot more coalition based, and I think generally as a big tent kind of person and someone who would be called a rhino by almost everyone on Twitter, that movement policing in general is bad for ideological discourse in this country, but it's still it's winning nonetheless.
Yeah, it's funny that you describe yourself as a pro-choice conservative, because there's an old joke, pro-choice conservative, isn't that another word for libertarian? Obviously I don't agree with that because I am a pro-life libertarian, and you don't agree with that because you're a pro-choice conservative who doesn't identify as libertarian. But it goes into the whole movement policing thing. Yeah, I tend to be in favor of big party politics as well. I mean, certainly when it comes to advancing causes I believe in, I want as many people behind me as possible. And that's why I used to be a political consultant, and I came over to work in journalism full time because I thought, if I can convince more people, just sort of out there in the general public to get behind these ideas, I think that, that's the best way to bring about change in the political system. But at the same time that I believe in big tents, it can be a little scary sometimes when, right now we have this phenomenon happening with Donald Trump, who is not a conservative by any definition of the word, who was a Democrat like the day before yesterday, who was strongly pro-choice, who supported the Clintons, who is now the front runner for the Republican nomination. And this is bizarre. I have no idea what to make of this, because as much as I'm in favor of sort of big tent politics, when you leave behind the most basic principles and values that a movement was built around, where does the movement go from there? I don't know what the answer is to that, and I don't think that Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee, and I'm sort of on the record making the case that polling this far out means very little. But it's still bizarre and fascinating, but also bizarre to watch what's happening right now and the traction he's gaining on the right, and wonder what these voters are thinking.
Right. I think is also a result of mass media, Twitter, social media. All of this are bubbles increasing in size and maybe only interacting with people who are on our side. But so much of politics nowadays is just affectation. And Donald Trump gets up on the stump and he attacks Obama in fairly vicious ways that and in ways probably a lot of other elected Republicans aren't willing to do or go to. He attacks the media in those same kinds of ways. It's a largely policy-less based campaign. But this graphic went viral on Twitter yesterday, 2 days ago, I don't remember, of a Huffington Post poll that phrased the same question in two different ways. And it was, do you support Barack Obama's universal health care program, or do you support Donald Trump's universal health care program? And just by phrasing it with just no policy, just universal health care, but with those two names, you can but you can equalize the support, basically. If you say, do you support Barack Obama's universal health program, it's like 90% of Democrats, 5% of Republicans or something. And if you say Donald Trump's universal health care program, it's 50% of Democrats and 50% of Republicans, which suggests that 50% of these partisan coalitions are solely affectation-based, and they're entirely about the name of the person or the identity of the person pushing it, and not about the policy behind it. And in that kind of an environment, I find it hard to say, as someone who is accused of not being a true conservative on many issues, I find it hard to say Donald Trump is not a real conservative and you people who self-identify as conservatives are idiots for supporting him. I find that hard to say. I prefer to say Donald Trump is a horrible person and you shouldn't support him for that reason. But I also find it hard to find what a strongly ideological conservative finds appealing in Donald Trump over, say, Ted Cruz, because they're both fairly bombastic, they're both very anti-Obama, and I'm not sure where the Donald Trump over Ted Cruz appeal comes from.
Yeah, one of the things that Republicans have often struggled with is coming across as likable, is coming across as someone who cares. 2012, Mitt Romney won on all the policy, in head-to-head polls. People chose Mitt Romney as more prepared to be president on all the policy issues. But when it came to who cares about people like me, Obama won. And he won by such a large margin that it actually led to him winning the election. Because people, they thought that he cared about people like me. That matters, and Republicans tend to struggle on that metric, people caring about people like me. And so when I used to be a consultant, I would often say, Republicans, you need to show that you care before they will care about what you have to say on the issues. You have to show people that they care about you. that you care about them, and that you want what's best for them, and then they will listen to you. If they don't think you don't like them, which is a problem that Hispanic voters often have with Republicans, they think that Republicans don't like them, so of course they don't care what they have to say about the policy issues. What's interesting with Donald Trump, though, is that he's not winning that battle. I mean, he's not winning by being likable, by being sympathetic and compassionate and showing that he really cares about people and voters. That's not at all what he's doing. So it's interesting to me that you say, I want to make the case that he's a crappy person. It seems pretty clear to me that he's a crappy person. He's not trying to hide it, and yet still he's doing really well with the voters. So that's what's been surprising to me.
Well, I wonder on that case if it's, and this has been written about, if it's just white identity politics, right? Is that if you're a middle American white person who had their probably wealth kind of destroyed, maybe doing poorly in the job market in the wake of 2008, who's kind of struggling, and you have Donald Trump kind of attacking this new style of politics, promising that the policies that you want or you thought made you successful will come back if he's going to, quote-unquote, make America great again, that those people do think that Donald Trump cares about them. And there are enough of those people to have him at consistently over 20% in a Republican primary. And so, and obviously, there's a very large swath of people who don't think Donald Trump cares about them. And, despite all the hand-wringing about Hillary's high negatives, Trump has even higher negatives going in. People don't think that he cares about basically anybody but himself, except for his fans who think that he maybe cares about them. I'm not sure. That's my stab at explaining his support.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good insight. That when I used to travel around the country doing focus groups, I was surprised by how strong the sentiment among sort of middle class voters was, that like they were afraid of immigrants. It wasn't the crime. It was this idea that like times are tough and we're barely getting by, and it's worse under Obama than it ever was before. And so we're afraid of what would happen if you let a bunch more people come into our country. Like, there are only so many jobs seems to be a common belief. And it's not that we dislike people who are from other countries. It's not that we think that, that they're dangerous per se, but we feel like there are only so many jobs, and so while we're struggling, we should be focused on getting the economy growing and making sure there are enough jobs for us, and not letting people come over here and potentially take those jobs from us. So that sentiment was always really strong, and I remember hearing that everywhere I went when I was traveling as a political consultant. And so I agree with you. I think you're right on the nose that the people who feel that way, that sort of sense of anxiety of where is this country going and is there going to be enough prosperity to go around, is probably those people are the ones who are sort of latching on to what Donald Trump is selling right now.
Sure. All right. Well, on that sympathetic note for Donald Trump supporters, why don't we end that there? Thanks for being with me today, Slade, and I will see everyone next time on Blogging Heads.
Thanks so much.